Are you ready for a thrilling journey through the dark and mysterious streets of London? Join us on Midnight Murmurs as we follow the journey of Detective William Fletcher and the enigmatic vampire Lord Alexander, as they try to solve a series of odd killings and unravel the secrets of a powerful artifact. Don't forget to like and subscribe to stay updated on the latest episodes of our spine-tingling mystery series. Chapter 1: The Vampire Lord Awakens. The dark and melancholy streets of London were calm, save for the sound of the howling wind that appeared to be warning of an imminent storm. The dull, faintly lit streetlights struggled to illuminate the surroundings, leaving most of the alleyways and nooks of the city in darkness. A tall guy with a long coat, walking stick, and a cap was going through the shadows, seeming almost as a ghost. As he traveled, the lamps flickered and sputtered, adding to the eeriness of the night. This was William Fletcher, a detective who had been investigating a succession of odd killings that had left the city in a state of panic. William was noted for his systematic approach to investigations, and his ability to solve problems that looked insurmountable to others. As he walked, his mind strayed to the case that had been occupying him for weeks now. The killings were exceptionally grisly, with each victim drained of all their blood, prompting some to assume that a vampire was involved. William rounded a corner and came onto a little cafe. He decided to take a break and walked inside, getting a cup of coffee. The cafe was darkly lit, with just a few customers, all of them engaged in their own world. William grabbed a table by the window, took a seat, and drinking his coffee as he watched the rain begin to fall down. As he sat there, lost in meditation, a lovely woman stepped into the cafe. She was tall, with long blonde hair and piercing blue eyes. William was instantly taken by her attractiveness, and he couldn't help but watch her as she headed to the counter to purchase a coffee. When she turned to go, their eyes locked for a brief time, and William felt something stir inside him that he couldn't describe. The woman stepped out into the pouring rain, and William followed, wanting to talk to her. He caught up with her a few blocks away from the cafe, and they began to converse. Her name was Elizabeth, and she was a writer, fresh to the city. As they strolled through the rain, William couldn't help but feel pulled to her. They spoke about everything and nothing, and soon it was late, and they both had to go their own ways. The next day, William was back at work, researching the killings. He went to attend the latest crime site, hoping to uncover some clues. As he strolled through the abandoned structure, he discovered something that made his blood run cold. There, on the wall, was a message, inscribed in blood: "The vampire lord is coming." William realized then that he was dealing with something much beyond his imagination. He knew that he had to solve the case before it was too late, and the city was plunged into darkness. And he couldn't ignore the idea that Elizabeth was somehow related to the case. As the days passed, William continued to investigate, putting together evidence, and attempting to make sense of the killings. He found himself thinking more and more about Elizabeth, and he couldn't escape the idea that she was in danger. One night, as he was leaving the workplace, he noticed Elizabeth waiting for him outside. She looked pale, and her eyes were filled with anxiety. She assured William that she had uncovered something that would assist him solve the case. And then she departed into the darkness, leaving William with a sensation of disquiet. William knew then that he was getting closer to the truth, and he couldn't help but worry what he would find when he eventually unearthed the truth. He understood that he was dealing with something much beyond his imagination, something dark and evil, and he was determined to stop it, no matter the cost. Chapter 2: The Mysterious Stranger. The vampire lord, whose name was Alexander, went along the cobblestone streets of London in quest of answers. His thoughts were muddled with distrust and terror. The latest killings had been too nasty, too premeditated, and too frequent for his comfort. He sensed that something dark and terrible was lurking in the shadows, but he couldn't quite put his finger on what it was. As he turned a corner, he spotted a man leaning against a brick wall. The visitor was tall and lanky, with a crooked nose and a scar over his left eyebrow. His eyes were an unpleasant shade of yellow, and they appeared to sparkle in the faint light. Alexander approached the man warily, his hand hanging over the hilt of his sword. "Who are you?" Alexander asked, his voice low and intimidating. The stranger grinned. "I could ask you the same thing." "I am Alexander," the vampire lord answered, keeping his ground. The stranger nodded. "I know who you are. You've been generating quite a fuss recently." Alexander lifted an eyebrow. "And what do you know about it?" The stranger shrugged. "Only that you're seeking for answers. And I might have a couple." Alexander narrowed his gaze. "What kind of answers?" The stranger chuckled. "The type that may help you capture the killer. But first, we need to chat in private." Alexander hesitated. He knew better than to trust strangers, especially ones with menacing grins and piercing eyes. But he also realized that he needed all the support he could get if he intended to solve this case. "Fine," he said. "Lead the way." The man led Alexander down a dark lane, past numerous abandoned buildings and mounds of rubbish. They finally halted in front of a derelict warehouse, its windows boarded up and its doors rusted shut. "Here we are," the stranger remarked, pulling a pair of keys from his pocket. He opened the door and indicated for Alexander to follow him inside. The warehouse was barely lighted, with a solitary flickering lamp dangling from the ceiling. The air was musty and wet, and the floor was covered with shattered glass and fragments of metal. Alexander's senses were on high alert, and he grasped his blade hard. "What is this place?" he questioned. The stranger grinned. "My little refuge. Don't worry, we're totally secure here. And I have something to show you." He strolled over to a pile of boxes in the corner of the room and began searching through them. Alexander regarded him suspiciously, his muscles tight and ready for action. After a few moments, the guy emerged with a little leather-bound book. He handed it to Alexander with a sneaky smirk. "Take a look," he urged. Alexander scanned over the pages, his eyes expanding with each passing second. The binder was loaded with comprehensive illustrations and descriptions of the killings he had been researching. It also included notes on the victim's personal life, their routines, and their behaviors. "How did you get this?" Alexander demanded, his voice quivering with wrath. The stranger shrugged. "Let's just say I have my methods. But the real question is, what are you going to do with it?" Alexander glared at the stranger. "I'm going to find the bastard who did this and make him pay." The stranger's smile grew. "That's what I like to hear. But be careful, Alexander. The murderer is closer than you believe." The vampire lord crouched in the shadows, waiting for his mystery informant to come. He had heard whispers about a tremendous item that might provide its possessor immense power, and he longed to know more. He had spent ages studying the occult and the esoteric, yet this was something fresh and strange. A person came from the darkness, clad in a heavy coat and a wide-brimmed hat that concealed his features. The vampire lord stiffened, ready to strike at the first indication of danger. The stranger held up his palms in a sign of peace. "I come in peace," he added in a hushed voice. "I have information that you may find useful." The vampire lord narrowed his eyes. "What do you know about the artifact?" The stranger grinned enigmatically. "I know that it is more powerful than anything you have ever encountered. It has the capacity to give immortality, to influence the minds of others, to bend reality to your will. But it also comes with a high price." "What price?" the vampire lord questioned, interested despite himself. "The price of your soul," the stranger remarked. "It will eat you, corrupt you, transform you into something less than human. But perhaps it is what you seek." The vampire lord felt a shiver go down his spine. Was this visitor some kind of demon, come to seduce him with forbidden knowledge? Or was he simply a maniac, babbling nonsense? He decided to play along. "How do I find this artifact?" he questioned. The guy leaned in, his voice lowering to a whisper. "It is hidden in a region of enormous power and great peril. A location where only the brave and the foolish dare to explore. A location named the Tomb of the Forgotten." The vampire lord knew about the Tomb of the Forgotten. It was a prohibited area, a burial site for the most powerful and terrible monsters in history. Only a few of mortals had ever visited its halls, and none had ever returned. "I will find it," the vampire lord murmured, his voice low and deadly. "And I will claim it as my own." The stranger nodded. "Good luck," he replied, turning to depart. The vampire lord watched him leave into the darkness, wondering who he was and what his genuine objectives were. But he put such thoughts away, for now he had a new aim. aim that would obsess him, test him, and possibly even destroy him. He headed off on his mission, determined to discover the item and reveal its secrets. Along the journey, he experienced all kinds of difficulties and problems. He faced terrible beasts, understood old mysteries, and risked dangerous traps. But as he grew closer to his goal, he began to understand that the stranger had been right. The relic was more powerful than anything he had ever imagined, and it was altering him, corrupting him, making him less human with each passing day. And suddenly, in the heart of the Tomb of the Forgotten, he found what he had been seeking. The relic blazed with a horrible green light, throbbing with strength and terror. He stretched out to touch it, and felt a wave of electricity go through him. But then he heard a voice that whispered to him from the depths of the artifact. It was a voice that whispered dark secrets, promised endless power, and asked a horrible price. The vampire lord hesitated, his fingers hovering above the relic. He knew that once he touched it, there would be no turning back. He would be eternally transformed, forever absorbed by its force. And still, he could not resist. He touched the relic, and felt his soul torn apart. He screamed in anguish, as he was eaten by the terrible force of the relic. Chapter 3: The Missing Heirloom. The city of London was buzzing with activity, but Alexander was in no mood to enjoy it. He had been accused of stealing a significant family artifact and was now the lead suspect in the investigation. He knew he was innocent, but the evidence was piled against him. Determined to clear his name, Alexander set out to locate the genuine perpetrator. He visited the victims' relatives and grilled them, but they were uncooperative and antagonistic towards him. Undeterred, Alexander resumed his inquiry, exploring the city for any clues. As he wandered through the streets of London, Alexander couldn't help but reflect about his recent hunt for the magical item. He had been consumed by its power, but now he wished he had never found it. He understood that it was the reason for his current position, yet he couldn't bring himself to destroy it. Alexander's thoughts were interrupted by the sound of a gunshot. He turned back to see a man fleeing away from a mob of people. He automatically raced after the stranger, following him through the small alleys and back streets of London. Finally, the man stopped and turned around, taking out a knife. Alexander understood that he had trapped the robber who had taken the relic. The robber leapt for Alexander with the knife, but he was no match for the vampire lord's power and quickness. With the criminal captured, Alexander restored the stolen artifact to its proper owner. The family was appreciative, but yet apprehensive of him. Alexander understood their suspicion, but he couldn't help but feel a feeling of unfairness. He had been accused of a crime he didn't commit, and had to go to tremendous measures to clear his reputation. As he went away from the family's mansion, Alexander knew that he was not alone. Elizabeth, the writer he had met earlier, was observing him from a distance. She had been watching him, and was amazed by his investigative abilities. Alexander couldn't help but feel a sense of satisfaction, knowing that he had won her respect. With the case completed, Alexander understood that he had to face the repercussions of his recent acts. He had been devoured by the power of the item, but now he realized that he had to destroy it before it destroyed him. He went off on a fresh mission, determined to free himself of the artifact's corrupting influence once and for all. Chapter 4: The Hunt Begins. Alexander strode along the dimly lighted alleyway, his senses heightened by the adrenaline of the chase. The robber who took the family heirloom was still out there, and he was determined to locate them. He stopped outside a tavern, the aroma of blood and booze floating through the air. As he arrived, the guests turned to gaze at him, their eyes following his every move. Alexander ignored them, scouring the room for any indication of the thief. And then he spotted her, a woman with long blonde hair, clothed in a black cloak, sitting at the bar. Alexander approached her, his footsteps booming across the empty area. "Hello," he murmured, his voice soft as silk. "I couldn't help but notice you sitting here all alone." The woman turned to him, her eyes narrowing. "And I couldn't help but notice you watching me." Alexander smirked, undeterred by her chilly manner. "I'm looking for someone, and I have reason to believe that you might know something about them." The woman lifted an eyebrow, fascinated. "And why would I help you?" "Because if you don't, I'll be forced to take matters into my own hands," Alexander added, his tone ominous. The woman grinned. "And if I do help you? Then I might be inclined to show you some mercy," Alexander said. The woman examined him for a minute, as though evaluating her choices. And then she spoke. "I might know something. But it'll cost you." Alexander nodded, reaching inside his pocket and drawing out a little bag of cash. He placed it on the bar in front of her. "Tell me everything you know," he urged. The woman accepted the bag of money, counting them carefully before speaking. "I heard some reports about a man who's been taking items from the affluent and powerful. They believe he's been holed up in an abandoned warehouse on the outskirts of the city." Alexander nodded. "Thank you for your help." He turned to go, but the woman called out to him. "Wait." Alexander turned back to her, fascinated. "If you locate him," she added, "bring him to me. I have some unfinished business with him." Alexander nodded, and then he was gone, his footsteps booming through the empty tavern as he made his way back out into the night. He headed towards the outskirts of the city, his mind racing with options. The thief was out there, and he was coming closer to discovering them. As he traveled, he couldn't help but ponder about the woman at the tavern. Who was she, and what was her link to the thief? Alexander knew that he was getting closer to the truth, but he also knew that danger waited around every turn. He had to be awake if he was to succeed in his task. And so he moved on, his pulse racing with eagerness as he prepared to face whatever trials lie ahead. The search had barely begun, and Alexander was determined to come out on top. Chapter 5: The Unexpected Ally. Alexander paced the abandoned warehouse, his mind racing with thoughts of the item and how to destroy it. He had been hunting for hours, but to no effect. Suddenly, a voice from behind him interrupted his thoughts. "Looking for something?" Alexander turned around, his teeth bared and ready to attack. But before he could make a move, a stranger appeared from the shadows. It was a lady, clad in black leather and holding a pair of silver daggers. "Who are you?" Alexander demanded, his eyes narrowing. The woman smirked slyly. "Let's just say I have a vested interest in seeing that relic destroyed. And I think we can benefit each other." Alexander watched her carefully. He had learned the hard way that trust was not something to be given freely. But something about the woman fascinated him. "What's your name?" he said. The lady walked nearer, her eyes glinting in the faint light. "Call me Raven," she said. Over the course of the following few hours, Raven proved to be a useful friend. She possessed knowledge that Alexander had been unable to find on his own, and she appeared to have a sixth instinct when it came to danger. As they examined the warehouse, they found upon an underground room that had been disguised behind a brick wall. Inside, they uncovered a succession of ancient items, including a golden amulet that glowed with an alien force. Alexander leaned out to touch the amulet, but Raven stopped him. "Don't touch it," she advised. "That thing is dangerous." Alexander hesitated. He knew that Raven was correct, but the temptation of the relic was too powerful. He could feel its force calling to him, pulling him closer. Suddenly, a trapdoor in the floor opened up, and Alexander and Raven were plunged into darkness. They landed in a gloomy and musty tunnel that appeared to go on forever. As they made their way through the tunnel, Alexander felt himself growing more and more dependent on Raven's leadership. She appeared to know just where to go, and he found himself following her direction without hesitation. But soon as they reached the end of the tunnel, Raven turned on him. She pulled her silver daggers and surged forward, her eyes filled with a cold and calculating rage. "I never intended to help you," she spat. "I've been working for the artifact's genuine owner all along. And now, you're going to die." Alexander was taken off surprise, but he wasn't defenseless. He mustered his vampire might and fought back with all the wrath he could manage. The combat was ferocious, with both sides dealing blow for blow. But in the end, Alexander emerged triumphant. Raven lay dead at his feet, her silver daggers clasped in her limp hands. As Alexander emerged from the tunnel, he understood that he had been played. Raven had been a decoy, sent to distract him while the genuine owner of the relic made off with it. But even as he seethed with wrath, Alexander knew that he couldn't give up. He was determined to get the relic back, no matter what the cost. and he realized that he would need all his might and wit if he was to prevail. With a tremendous resolution in his heart, Alexander went forth into the darkness, ready to face whatever challenges were ahead. Chapter 6: The Betrayal. Alexander sat in his darkened study, his mind a muddled tangle as he struggled to understand what had just transpired. He had believed Raven was his ally, his buddy, but she had turned on him with a wicked smile and a flick of her silver daggers. How had he been so blind? He clenched his hands, feeling the wrath bubbling within of him. He had trusted her, confided in her, and she had exploited his vulnerability against him. He had no one to blame but himself for his folly, but that didn't stop the bitterness from sneaking into his heart. He rose up from his chair and began pacing the room, his thoughts racing as he attempted to come up with a strategy. He knew that he couldn't let Raven get away with what she had done, but he also knew that he was no match for her alone. He wanted aid, but he didn't know who he could trust. He halted in his pacing, his eyes resting on a tiny wooden box on his desk. It held a vial of his own blood, something he had gathered long ago as a precaution. He took up the box and opened it, bringing out the vial and examined it in the faint light. He closed his eyes, took a deep breath as he concentrated his attention on a single name, Elizabeth. She was the only person he could trust, the only one who had remained by him through thick and thin. He had never revealed his actual nature to her, but he hoped that she would still be eager to aid him. He slid the vial of blood into his pocket and made his way to her flat, his head still racing with ideas of treachery and retribution. He knocked on her door, his pulse thumping in his chest as he waited for her to answer. When she answered the door, he could see the anxiety imprinted on her face. "Alexander, what's wrong? You look like you've seen a ghost." He rushed past her, his eyes scouring the room for any signs of danger. "I need your help," he replied, his voice low and anxious. "Raven has deceived me. I don't know what she's planning, but I know that it can't be good." Elizabeth's eyes widened in disbelief. "Raven? But I thought she was your friend." "She was," Alexander hissed. "But now she's my adversary. I need your aid to take her down before she can cause any more damage." Elizabeth paused for a time, her eyes flashing with apprehension. But then she nodded forcefully. "Okay. What do you need me to do?" Alexander took a deep breath, feeling a weight lift off his shoulders. He had believed he was alone in this war, but now he had someone he could trust on. "First, I need you to keep an eye out for anything strange. Raven won't hesitate to attack again, and I need to know what she's plotting." Elizabeth nodded, her look serious. "I'll do my best." "Second," Alexander said, "I need you to assist me track down the item. Raven took it from me, and I need to get it back before she can use it for her own malicious goals." Elizabeth's eyes widened. "The artifact? The one that can offer immortality?" Alexander nodded grudgingly. Yes. It's a lethal weapon in the wrong hands, and Raven is the wrongest of them all. Elizabeth took a deep breath, her eyes gleaming with purpose. Okay. I'm in. Let's do this. Alexander grinned, feeling a flash of optimism in his breast. Maybe he wasn't so alone after all. Maybe he had an opportunity to make things right. Chapter 7: The Showdown. Alexander had prepared himself for this time. He stood in the abandoned warehouse, surrounded by his foes. Raven, the lady who had betrayed him, stood in the front, flanked by her army of vampires. Alexander stood alone, yet he was not terrified. He went into his pocket and drew out the bottle of his own blood. He had concocted a unique concoction, one that would weaken his adversaries and give him an advantage in the fight. Give me the artifact, Alexander, Raven commanded, her voice chilly and ominous. I don't have it, Alexander responded, his eyes fixated on Raven. Don't lie to me, Raven snarled. I know you have it. And I know you're weak without it. Alexander didn't reply. He easily unscrewed the lid of the vial and drank the contents in one go. He felt the strength flood through his veins, and he knew he was ready. The fight was harsh and fierce. Alexander battled with all his might, bringing out vampire after vampire with his bare fists. But Raven was his genuine opponent, and she was not going down without a fight. Their struggle was a ballet of death, each move measured and exact. Alexander was fueled by his fury and resolve, while Raven was fueled by her thirst for power. As they struggled, Alexander could feel the artifact beckoning to him, pushing him to grab it and utilize its power. But he resisted. He understood that he could not allow the artifact rule him. Finally, after what felt like hours, Alexander emerged triumphant. Raven lay at his feet, defeated. Finish me, Raven hissed, her eyes full with venom. But Alexander shook his head. No. I won't become like you. I won't let the item overwhelm me. He turned and walked away, leaving Raven and her army of vampires behind. As he went out into the darkness, Alexander realized that his adventure was far from ended. But he also realized that he had gone a long way. He had battled his demons and emerged stronger. And he knew that whatever occurred next, he was ready for it. Chapter 8: The Aftermath. Alexander sat in his dimly lit study, looking off into the distance as he thought the circumstances that had led him to this place. He had battled with all his strength and emerged triumphant, but at what cost? The aftermath of the war left him feeling empty, lost, and alone. He had come to the understanding that he was no longer the guy he used to be. His ambition for power had overtaken him, and his lust for immortality had nearly ruined him. The relic that he had coveted for so long had been a curse masquerading as a gift, and he had nearly fallen subject to its lethal temptation. Alexander realized that he had to make a decision regarding his future. He couldn't continue down the path of devastation that he had been on, but he also couldn't deny his actual nature. He was a vampire, and it was something that he couldn't alter. As he sat in his study, lost in meditation, he heard a quiet knock on his door. It was Elizabeth, the lady who had become his closest friend in his hunt for the item. She entered the room and sat down next him. "Are you all right?" she inquired, anxiety engraved on her features. Alexander breathed heavily. "I don't know," he said, shaking his head. "I feel as though I have lost my way." Elizabeth placed a soothing touch on his shoulder. "You have been through a lot," she remarked. "But you have also gone a long way. You vanquished Raven and her army, and you have demonstrated that you are stronger than the evil that threatens to swallow you." Alexander nodded carefully. "You're right," he responded. "But I still don't know what path to take next." Elizabeth smiled faintly. "That's okay," she said. "You don't have to figure it all out right now. Just take some time to relax and heal. When you're ready, we can work out what the next step is together." Alexander felt a sensation of relaxation rush over him. He knew that he could depend on Elizabeth to be there for him, no matter what. He closed his eyes and let out a big breath, feeling a weight lifted off his shoulders. As the two sat in solitude, Alexander began to ponder about his actual nature as a vampire. He had spent so long battling against it, trying to deny who he was. But maybe it was time to accept it. "Elizabeth," he answered hesitantly. "I think I know what I need to do next." She stared at him with fascination. "What is it?" "I need to embrace my nature as a vampire," he replied forcefully. "I can't keep hiding who I am. I need to learn how to manage my talents and use them for good." Elizabeth nodded in agreement. "I think that's a good plan," she remarked. "But we need to be careful. There are still risks out there, and we don't want to attract too much attention." Alexander grinned. "Don't worry," he said. "I've learnt my lesson. I won't let my hunger for power overwhelm me again." With a sudden feeling of purpose, Alexander rose up from his chair and moved towards the window, peering out into the blackness of the night. He realized that his trip was far from complete, but he felt a feeling of serenity knowing that he had a course to pursue. As Elizabeth rose up to depart, she turned to him and whispered, "We'll get through this together, Alexander." "I know we will." Alexander looked to her with a faint smile on his lips. "Thank you, Elizabeth," he said. "For everything." And with that, Elizabeth left the room, leaving Alexander alone with his thoughts. He realized that there would be obstacles ahead. Thanks for watching, and I hope you enjoyed this chapter of our mystery fiction book. If you want to see more content like this, don't forget to like and subscribe to Midnight Murmurs for future updates. We're always exploring new stories and characters, so stay tuned for more exciting adventures in the world of mystery and intrigue. Until next time, happy reading.